yra feminizmo klausimas.
Drug policy is a feminist issue.
Kebijakan terkait narkotika adalah isu feminis.
นโยบายยาเสพติดเป็นปัญหาของสิทธิสตรี
Good afternoon, everyone. And I recall last talking on these issues at the Harm Reduction International Conference at the Melbourne Convention Centre, I think around 3 years ago, which was a wonderful occasion. And Kirsten Han from Singapore, who's going to be online, was on our panel with us then, and a very bold voice against the death penalty in Singapore. So thank you to the many organisations which have come together to host this event. As was said, I wear two hats today. One is as chair of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, and the other a member of the International Commission Against the Death Penalty. We have our plenary actually coming up at the beginning of June, so it will be good to report a little bit on this. At the Global Commission, we campaign against prohibition. We campaign for fundamental change to the UN drug conventions, which we believe are wrong-headed and have mandated, quote, the war on drugs, which is a war on people, which has led to countless deaths, to displacement, dislocation, over-incarceration, the long list of harms which come from that so-called war on drugs. And of course, the problem is that drug policy has, in general, since these conventions were put in place, been framed as a criminal justice issue. We reject that at the Global Commission. We say these issues are health issues, they're gender issues, they're human rights issues, they're development issues, and they need a completely different kind of approach. So, the current approach to drug policy around the world, most countries, continues to rely very heavily on punitive measures for drug control, including criminalisation and locking people up, and of course, in extremis, in a number of jurisdictions, still the death penalty, which I'm totally opposed to with every bone of my body. And we see these punitive approaches disproportionately affecting people who are poor and people who are marginalised for whatever reasons, reinforcing structural inequalities, including gender inequities. Of course, the enforcement approaches have much broader social consequences. I'll never forget going with Ruth Dreyfus, who was my predecessor as the chair of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, to a prison in Mexico City around 6-7 years ago, and we met women who were serving very, very long sentences for being very minor couriers in the supply chain. And those women, if they'd had small children, were able to have them with them in prison till the age of 5. There was actually a childcare centre and they could have their small child with them. Age 5, out of there, they didn't really see their kids except on a visiting day if they lived nearby for the next 15, 20 years. It's heartbreaking what this does to families. Breaks up families, breaks up caregiving networks, affects the stability of households and community well-being. So, let's come now to the specific issue around the death penalty and women and the so-called drug offending. Hundreds of women currently face the death penalty for drug offences around the world. Their names are generally largely unknown, and their cases are rarely reported. If there's a case that comes to international attention, sometimes that will capture the global imagination. But for the most part, these women are not visible. Most of them are poor, most of them are in the global south, most are in countries where so-called drug trafficking thresholds trigger automatic death sentences. I'm completely opposed to automatic sentences of any kind. It leaves no room for judicial discretion, but I'm opposed to the death penalty any place, anywhere, for any alleged offence. Now, when you have these mandatory sentencing frameworks, there's no interest in what a woman's personal circumstances may have been or be. No consideration given to their role in the so-called offence, which may have been very minor. The conditions that got them into the position they're now in are legally irrelevant where you have mandatory sentencing frameworks. Now, at the Global Commission on Drug Policy, we state, while we're completely opposed to the death penalty, that in particular the death penalty for drug offences, so-called, is a violation of international law. We say that drug offending does not meet the, quote, most serious crimes threshold required by Article 6 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. So we say applying the death penalty for so-called drug offending raises very serious concerns under international human rights law, particularly with regard to proportionality and fairness in sentencing, and that its continued use in some jurisdictions remains a matter of very urgent international concern. We see this violation of international law occurring in plain sight in multiple jurisdictions and, as I say, affecting hundreds of women. The women on death row are convicted in such a way that punitive drug policy, law and implementation ignores whatever coercion, trafficking, economic desperation may have been drivers of their involvement in this drug supply chain. So, the woman on death row is in most cases not a powerful actor at the heart of an organised crime network. In most cases, the woman will be the most expendable person in the network, recruited because her vulnerability makes her useful, prosecuted because her low-level role makes her visible and catchable, sentenced to death under these frameworks that make her circumstances legally irrelevant. So we see this lethal punishment of death penalty being handed down to the most marginalised people in the drug supply chain, leaving the most powerful, so often untouched, using the machinery of criminal law to complete what poverty, trafficking, patriarchy, a range of factors have already begun, which is the destruction of women's lives. This, of course, is not justice, it is systemic failure, and it has fatal consequences where the death penalty is implemented. I understand that some today will address in some detail the case of Mary Jane Veloso of the Philippines, whose case became a symbol of everything wrong with the mandatory application of the death penalty to so-called drug trafficking. She represents really our demand for abolition of mandatory drug sentencing, of the death penalty, of the framework that treats the most vulnerable as the most culpable. So this is not merely about legal arguments, it's a demand for justice. We call for abolition of mandatory sentencing for so-called drug offences, abolition of the death penalty, and abolition of the punitive framework which punishes vulnerability as if it were actually power. There is so much evidence that there are far more effective approaches to drug policy which are grounded in public health and harm reduction and social protection, approaches which prioritise human dignity, inclusion and access to services rather than punishing people. So I think a big question now is, how do drug policy frameworks, how could we make them align with international human rights standards, which they most certainly do not at the moment, and with our broader commitments to sustainable development and gender equity. We have to ensure that drug policy reform is also gender transformative so that it can empower and liberate women rather than subjecting them to these many layered and intersecting forms of discrimination and oppression. Let me say one more word about a development which I'm sure a number of you will be aware of, but perhaps not everyone. And that is that at the Commission on Narcotic Drugs meeting in Vienna in March last year, there was a resolution passed calling on the Commission and the UN Secretary General to set up a high-level panel to look at the current global drug policy framework and the extent to which it related to other very important frameworks like human rights, and to make recommendations on what should be done. I must say I've always been very worried about this resolution and a high-level panel emanating from it, and my concerns are now heightened because one of the two co-chairs is from Singapore, and at the first meeting, I'm told, took a very hardline position. Now, Professor Adiba is on the commission, on the panel. At the Global Commission, we advocated very hard for people with a progressive perspective to be on. Adiba is one of them. The former mayor of Prague, the Czech Republic, who's a commissioner of ours, Pavel Bem, and very forward-leaning and progressive on these issues is another. But there really needs to be civil society outrage that we could even go backwards with a panel like this, unless there's a huge push to get perspectives before it, which say that the drug policy conventions we have are driving all these human rights horrors, from the implementation of the death penalty to the summary executions to the forced displacement to the over-incarceration, all of the horror story that we know. So you may want to go away and do a little Googling if you're not on top of this, and just see where entry points for your organisations might be to make your voices heard, because I am very concerned that this panel could go the wrong way, not the right way. Thank you very much.
I'd like now to announce the beginning of our first session, Centering Resistance to Gendered Drug Policy. And again, it's my great honour to welcome Professor Emeritus Dato Dr. Adiba Kamarulzaman to the panel. I think we have Prof. Adiba on screen. You can read about Prof. Adiba here. I'd just like to add that her research and policy work has contributed a great deal to the evidence-based approach to drug policy. And Dr. Adiba is a commissioner of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, as Helen Clark has just told us. Welcome, Prof. Adiba. You can hear us?
Thank you. Yes, I can. Thank you
wonderful.
Very much, Lynette. Yeah.
You have long and deep experience working in this area of illicit drugs. In an interview I watched with you on YouTube, you described your approach, and I quote, "a human rights approach, doing the right thing, backed by science and evidence to ensure people live a healthy life. There is nothing to be afraid of." And I was very inspired by those words. So, Dr. Adiba, could you please share your insights and how drug policy is gendered, and also the relevance of a human rights approach? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynette, and thank you to the organising and partner organisations for inviting me to be part of this timely and critical session. As you heard from Helen, there are movements internationally which I think without your input could go wrong. I feel like I'm carrying quite a weight on my shoulders to make sure that the deliberations at the UN expert panel progresses the kinds of changes that we want to see. So I invite all of you to perhaps connect with us. In Australia, there's Mike Farrell from the NDARC, who's also on the expert panel. Now, turning to the discussions today, as you heard, the Global Commission on Drug Policy, of which I'm very honored and privileged to be a member of alongside Helen, has for over 15 years documented the disproportionate gendered impacts of punitive drug policies. And we've just heard how these impacts reflect and reinforce the structural inequalities affecting women and gender diverse people across all regions. If I could just highlight some of the statistics that that have been reported around this issue, we know that women are disproportionately incarcerated for drug-related offences, often for low-level, non-violent roles in the supply chain of the drug market. It has been noted that 35% of women in prison are incarcerated for drug offences. So imagine that more than 1 in 3 women in prison are there for drug offences, compared to 19% of men. Many incarcerated women are single mothers or primary caregivers, meaning imprisonment affects not only individuals, but families and entire communities, and create a vicious cycle for families which are already often living on the edge in poverty and terrible social circumstances. Women deprived of liberty are more likely to experience violence and coercion, including physical and psychological abuse, to obtain confessions or false testimonies. And this intersectionality of race, class, and migration drives these already economically deprived communities disproportionately from racial and ethnic minority groups, and are involved in low-level drug offences, frequently driven by economic necessity or coercion. So before the legal reform in countries such as mine, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand, most women who are foreign nationals on death row were there for drug trafficking. And these cases, once again, reflect structural inequalities in our justice systems, where women are often arrested in low-level courier roles where high-level actors remain insulated. The application of the death penalty for drug offences raises fundamental concerns of proportionality, discrimination, and human rights compliance, as you heard from Commissioner Helen Clark just before. And so it is this most extreme expression of punitive drug policy that must be abolished. In how I got involved in this area, particularly in terms of prevention of HIV amongst people who use drugs, we note that women who inject drugs have significantly higher HIV prevalence than men. The median is 15%, once again, compared to 9% among men, driven by gender inequality, exposure to violence, and engagement in unsafe sex work. Access to harm reduction, drug dependence treatment, and healthcare is often constrained by stigma, discrimination, and punitive legal frameworks, and services that are often not designed for women, especially for women with young families. Criminalization then discourages women and girls from accessing essential services, including pain management, treatment for substance use disorders, reproductive health services, or other essential care. Women who use drugs, particularly mothers and pregnant women, on top of the, because of the stigma and discrimination, often avoid health services due to fear of arrest or child removal. Custody decisions are frequently driven by stigma rather than evidence of harm or neglect. And the incarceration of mothers is especially harmful to children, as you heard the example that Helen just shared with us in Mexico that she observed. And these individuals are going to experience emotional trauma and increased risk of intergenerational contact with the criminal justice systems. So overall, punitive drug policies result in disproportionate harm to women and gender diverse people. undermining human rights, family integrity, and societal well-being. Women face higher rates of incarceration for minor offences, risk coercive medical practices, and encounter barriers to essential health services. We already know that there are effective alternatives. There are approaches that reject criminalization, punishment, and prohibition, and those that center public health, human rights, gender equality, and the empowerment of women and gender diverse people. And we have seen that legal reform in abolishment of the mandatory death penalty, such as what has happened in Malaysia and the low application of death penalty in Thailand, can lead to the number of women sentenced to reduce dramatically. For courts in the region to recognize gender-specific mitigating factors such as histories of domestic violence or the role of a low-level courier as reasons to avoid the death penalty. Nevertheless, a number of women in Indonesia on death row are there for drug offences. Therefore, we call for the total abolishment of the death penalty, which will remove this structural barrier that disproportionately affects women and gender diverse people. But this is going to require sustained investment in harm reduction and evidence-based treatment, with services designed and delivered with and for women and gender diverse people from the outset, not as an afterthought. It will also require comprehensive wraparound support addressing legal, economic, health, and family needs. Now, intervention that not only address issues of intersectionality, but they must also be there to improve equity for women and gender diverse people to access services. All in all, we must shift from criminalization to evidence, health and human rights-based approaches that address structural vulnerability, including poverty and coercion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Prof. Adiba. It's a wonderfully clear description of the issues that we're here to discuss today, and our best wishes to you. I'd like now to move on to our next speaker, Ellie Morrison. And Ellie's from an organisation called AVIL, which is a peer-led organisation and represents a network of peer-based harm reduction and drug user organisation. AVIL's focused on advancing the health and human rights of people with lived or living experience of drug use. And Elle has worked both locally and internationally with communities of people who inject drugs since 2001, sharing her experience in peer leadership and so on. Ellie is the Deputy Director of AVIL. Thanks, Ellie. Just to start off, AVIL has a long history in Australia and internationally of addressing gendered impacts of drug policy. From your organisational perspective and your own experience, could you talk about the impact of gendered drug policy? Give us some examples of activities to reduce harm and bring change. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynette. As Lynette has said, I am a woman with living and lived experience of injecting drug use, and that's what I want to talk about today. We are in every community in the world. We cross every nationality, every culture, every profession, every community. We are transgender women, gay women, women who do sex work, women of colour, and in this country, Aboriginal women who are particularly negatively impacted by the war on drugs. And yet when we talk about women changing the world, we are often not included in that conversation. Our voices are rarely heard. We're considered difficult and too complex. So our experiences of gender and sexuality, our drug use, poverty, stigma and criminalisation, it doesn't sit in neat boxes. It's our daily reality and it's our living experience, and it shapes how the world treats us. So as we've already heard today, for many of us, the world has had a profound and often violent impact on us. We know from our living experience and strong evidence that violence against women who use drugs is not the exception, it's the norm. In a recent study by College, Frisbee, Stewart and others, 82% of Australian women who use drugs had experienced at least one assault, and 38% had experienced sexual assault. So that's more than 4 out of 5 of us. That's not random, that is structural. Violence is frequently perpetrated by intimate partners, but for us, coercive control extends far beyond intimate relationships. We're excluded from domestic violence services because we use drugs, or we don't seek help because we're afraid of what will happen if we do. The systems that are meant to protect us are often the ones that are perpetrating the violence. Again, it's already been said, but police and child protection services are the services that we often won't access because we're afraid of what will happen when we do, because our children will be taken or we will experience violence from those authorities. It's one of the most powerful barriers that we face, and it has nothing to do with our ability to care for our children or the things that we do in society outside of our own drug use. We can be, and we are, often loving, capable, deeply committed parents, part of the community, but our drug use is used against us. So we see a cycle, we experience violence, we're excluded from services, then we're punished for seeking help, and we're left to navigate that violence alone. Criminalisation, stigma and poverty reinforce the systems that decide who is seen as deserving of safety and care. Too often we are not seen as deserving. And it's not just gender inequality, it's gendered structural violence. But that's not all of it. We don't just survive these systems, we change them. Women who use drugs have always been at the forefront of advocacy for the health and human rights of people who use drugs. Globally, we've led movements like the International Network of People Who Use Drugs. In Australia, we built the drug user organisations like AVIL. We fought for harm reduction, for needle and syringe programs, for HIV treatment, for dignity, for human rights. And now we're seeing this leadership incredibly powerfully in the work that we're doing in Fiji. So Fiji is experiencing the fastest growing HIV epidemic in the world. By the end of this year, around 9,000 to 11,000 people will likely test positive for HIV, and people who inject drugs are at the centre of the epidemic, making up around 48% of people who are starting treatment. It's a public health emergency. And in this context, peer-led responses are not optional, they're essential. I work with the Angels Collective in Suva. It's the first peer-led outreach program and the only project in Fiji currently focused on people who inject drugs. There's a group of 14 peer educators, people with lived and living experience of using drugs, and in their first 22 weeks of work, they delivered over 5,600 occasions of service. And what matters just as much as those numbers is who's doing this work. 7 of those 14 peer educators are transgender women, and 2 are young women with children. They're women at the sharpest edges of stigma and criminalisation, working alongside their male peers and leading Fiji's HIV response for people who inject drugs. They're building trust in communities where the systems often don't work for them. They're sharing life-saving information with other transgender women, with sex workers and their clients, with young people, and with gay and straight women and men. Peer workers do this every day around the world. They do it when they risk arrest, violence and stigma. Peer work is not just drug user organisations, it's not just service delivery, it's resistance. It challenges the idea that we're passive, broken or incapable. It shows that we lead, we organise, we care for our communities, and we create change where the systems have failed us. And the Angels Collective shows us something else, the power of civil society and lived and living experience. When the people most affected by an issue are leading the response, change happens. But this work does not sustain itself. It must be properly supported, funded and resourced, because without that support, those life-saving responses cannot continue or grow. So when we talk about women having an impact on the world, this is what we mean. Impact is not only found in the formal leadership spaces like this, it's also found in peer educators sharing safer injecting information on the streets of Suva, in transgender women building trust with their communities, in mothers who continue to lead and advocate despite the systems that work against them. We're already changing the world. The question is not whether we have an impact. The question is whether the world will recognise it, support it and stand with us. Because when it does, our impact is extraordinary. Thank you.
Oh, bravo, Ellie. Thank you. I'd like to introduce to the podium Ruth Bergen. Ruth works with the Women and Harm Reduction International Network. It's led by women and gender-expansive people who use drugs and has a global membership of around 500 allies. RIN is dedicated to addressing the health and social challenges created by gendered and punitive drug policy. For RIN, harm reduction is about dignity, autonomy and safety, as well as public health. Ruth's a harm reduction advocate and concerned with drug policy and gender intersection. So Ruth, you've worked in this field since the late 1980s, so a long time, and are the founder of RIN. We know that RIN has tried to collaborate with the women's movement. Unfortunately, feminism and the movement hasn't always been inclusive of women who use drugs. In fact, was associated with prohibition and normative models for quite a long time. But we also know that feminism is powerful. It's a powerful force for change. So I'm wondering if you could talk about your experiences in working with the feminist movement and some suggestions for moving forward on that relationship. Thank you.
I will try. Thanks very much, Lynette. Hello, everyone. I want to begin my short talk by naming a glass ceiling within the women's movement, one which limits the visibility and influence of women who use drugs and their leadership and their expertise. The women's movement has not, unfortunately, been immune to the prohibition propaganda machine, which tends to function actually as a smokescreen to conceal structural oppression. Women who use drugs are still cast in stereotypes as bad women, irresponsible, immoral, lacking control, lacking credibility. And this is striking because the women's movement has spent decades challenging exactly those kinds of judgments, challenging the idea that women must be pure or self-sacrificing, controlled in order to be worthy of rights. It is important to understand that drug use is not an anomaly. It is part of the human condition and here to stay. Across time, across cultures, people have always sought ways to alter consciousness, to feel, to connect, to explore, to experience relief, pleasure, transcendence. The reality is demand will always exist and there will be supply. Even the most aggressive and expensive drug control efforts have only ever made marginal dents in the markets and cannot eliminate drugs. What they do instead is reshape context in dangerous ways while installing gendered systems of social control. Women and gender diverse people who use drugs do face specific compounding harms, and please note as I list just some of them, how it is the context of criminalisation that is operative, not the drugs and not the women taking them. Loss of child custody, not because of proven poor parenting, but because of moral judgment. Obstetric violence, being denied pain relief, coerced into sterilisation or abortion, or punished for drug use during pregnancy. Violence, women who use drugs experience, as Ellie was giving some data from Australia, but elsewhere, up to 24 times the rate experienced by women in the general population, including at the hands of police and with little or no recourse. Shelters demand abstinence before entry, trapping women who use drugs in cycles of violence, and when we call for help, the police, far from being protectors, are often a threat, ignoring the violence and looking to prosecute the drugs instead. Disproportionate sentencing and rates of incarceration with no heed to the Bangkok rules, which encourage non-custodial responses for non-violent, petty offences. Other speakers today will be looking at the sharpest end of that, unpacking the regressive expression through a discussion of the death penalty. Punitive responses, including imprisonment, forced or coerced rehabilitation, child removal or intensified policing, do not improve individuals or societies and indeed cause much damage. Drug policy and patriarchy, and not the drugs or the women who use them, are at the root of much injustice and harm. Please see the existence of women and gender diverse people who use drugs directly challenges patriarchal expectations. We challenge the idea that good women must be controlled, compliant, self-denying. We challenge the idea that women's bodies exist to be regulated by the state, by institutions, or by social norms. Bodily autonomy is already central in feminist movements. When we talk about reproductive rights, sexual autonomy, or freedom from violence, women and gender diverse people who use drugs are also asserting bodily autonomy. We are asserting the right to decide what goes into our bodies, the right to alter our own consciousness, the right to experience not just survival, but sensation, relief, adventure, and pleasure. These are all things that the women's movement has fought to reclaim in other areas of life, and yet here it becomes somehow uncomfortable territory. We ask that you don't reduce people who use drugs to symptoms instead of recognising us as full human beings navigating complex realities along with oppressive structures. The gendered impacts of punitive drug policy should be acknowledged as an intersectional axis within the women's movement, as another clear system of gendered oppression to be fought and expunged. It is time to put substance behind the rhetoric of leaving no woman behind. At this time, with rising space for anti-gender rights actors, shrinking funding and increasing pressure on rights-based approaches, the women's movement cannot afford to be selective about whose autonomy it defends. We know that what does work are humane, evidence-based, gender-responsive approaches with meaningful involvement from women and gender-diverse people who use drugs, who must be recognised as the experts on their own lives. We need gender-responsive harm reduction, decriminalisation, and ultimately legal regulation of drug markets to reduce violence and gendered exploitation. Our call here is for a shift in perspective to recognise that women who use drugs are not outside the feminist movement. We must be welcomed as a prima part of it. Our experiences are not marginal because they are central to our understanding of how power operates over bodies. A feminist movement that leaves us behind is a movement that accepts limits on autonomy and abandons women to the carceral state. If we are serious about leaving no woman behind, then it must apply even when it's uncomfortable, when it challenges assumptions that may be long held. And the women's movement must embrace those most affected by oppressive systems, the very oppressive systems it seeks to change. If we don't include the most marginalised, any victory we claim rings hollow. So now is the time for us to come together and smash through that glass ceiling.
Yep. Thank you, Ruth. Reclaim the space. I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Ailish Brennan. Welcome, Ailish. Ailish is coming to us from Berlin today. Harm Reduction International is an NGO promoting harm reduction and drug policy reform. Harm Reduction International uses data and advocacy to inform and promote reform and envisage a world in which drug policies uphold dignity, health and rights. Ailish currently works in the Sustainability Finance team at HRI. She's a harm reductionist and drug policy advocate who brings an intersectional lens to highlight the impacts of punitive drug policies on women, young people, LGBTQI plus communities of people who use drugs. So do we have Ailish online? Over to you, Ailish. I'll keep talking because I'm sure you can hear me. Hi, Ailish.
Hello.
Welcome.
Hi. Thanks, Lynette.
Hey, Ailish. HRI coordinates the Divest Invest campaign. Can you tell us a bit more about that campaign, especially in relation to global funding cuts and their impact? Also to talk a bit about the impact of the anti-rights movement. How can communities of people who use drugs respond to these current trends? Thanks, Ailish.
Thanks, Lynette, and thank you everyone for joining us today. In the interest of time, I'll focus mostly on the funding piece, as I think the community responses and resilience are very, very well covered by the other speakers here today. So punitive drug policies, which we discussed a lot today, cost money. All of these arrests, all of this policing, prison time, the forced rehabilitation, it all costs money. The war on drugs costs governments and society as a whole vast amounts of money that is clearly not being spent on services of actual benefit to women and gender diverse people who use drugs. Our campaign is all about highlighting this ineffectiveness and showing that money is available, it's just being mismanaged. In the 10 years leading up to 2021, governments used official development assistance to channel $974 million worth of aid funding into the war on drugs. This includes at least $64 million in countries that retain the death penalty for drug offences. This is only aid spending, so money which should be spent on positive, developmental, even feminist projects. And it doesn't include, for example, the $1 billion the US government spends on international drug control efforts through its own government agencies like the DEA. I encourage you all to to research how much your own governments are spending on this and consider how it could be put to better use. Funding for harm reduction has historically been critically low, only a tiny fraction of what was needed even before the funding cuts of last year. Since these cuts, networks have been gutted. Research by the International Network of People Who Use Drugs shows that at the start of last year, almost half of all respondents reported that the lack of services for women who use drugs was among the biggest impacts of these funding cuts. It further found that almost 70% of services with programs specifically for women and gender diverse people who use drugs have been forced to halt any outreach to the communities. We can't build a movement without reaching the people most effective, and all of the advocacy and activism we're discussing today requires support. Funding for our work comes predominantly in the guise of the HIV response, something that's crucially important, but limits the scope of work and shows that funding from other sources, such as feminist donors, is really not available to us. Without funding, our ability to fight for abolition of the death penalty, to resist the war on drugs, to even fight for basic equality and rights is restricted. While communities are helping each other to survive, this can only last for so long without support and completely reduces any capacity to work towards improving this reality. All of this is taking place, all of the funding cuts are happening while women and gender diverse people who use drugs continue to be arrested, continue to have children taken from them, continue to face significantly increased rates of gender-based violence without access to any form of justice. Criminalization, punitive policies, and involuntary and abstinence-based rehabilitation do nothing to improve the realities of women and gender diverse people who use drugs. The war on drugs continues to drive widespread human rights abuses and continues to target women and gender diverse people in specifically gendered ways, all while wasting valuable resources. As our campaign, which you alluded to in the opening, says, we must divest from the unjust war on drugs, and we must absolutely invest in gender-responsive harm reduction, in SRHR, and in feminist efforts to resist the war on drugs. Thank you.
Thank you, Ailish. Very, very succinct and clear. So that ends the first section of our presentation today, our discussion today. And I'd now like to move on to the abolition of the death penalty section. Again, please hold any questions you have to the end. I'd like to introduce Sarah Cowell. Sarah's the director of Ilios Justice at Monash Uni. Ilios aims to restrict and abolish the death penalty in the Asia region through research and advocacy. Sarah's also the Vice Chair of Capital Punishment Justice Project and Deputy Convener of the Anti-Death Penalty Asia Network. So, thank you, Sarah. Over to you.
Thank you. So, as Lynette said, we're now going to focus on the most punitive area of drug policy that there is, the death penalty. We're joined on Zoom by speakers from Singapore, Indonesia and the Philippines, who I'll introduce as we cross to them. Just for context, in 2024, 42% of global executions were in relation to drug offending, despite this being an absolute clear breach of the Article 6 of the ICCPR. So we know that when executions are taking place, 42% are clearly outside the scope of any argument that they're permissible. Last month, Harm Reduction International reported that in 2025 there was a 97% increase from the year before in terms of drug-related executions. So that is huge, and that's largely attributable to Iran and the executions taking place there. This figure includes at least 23 women. In 2025, Iran executed 20 women, Saudi Arabia executed 2 women, and Singapore executed 1 woman. Harm Reduction International also noted that 18 countries sentenced people to death in 2025, including 10 countries across Asia, and that there are at least 56 women on death row for drug offences currently. We know that women on death row are convicted of drug offences at a far higher rate than men. And this is what we're going to focus on today, and most appropriately is to start with Kirsten Hahn. Kirsten Hahn is my colleague on the Executive Committee of the Anti-Death Penalty Asia Network. Kirsten is a journalist and an activist from Singapore, so really living in the absolute coalface of mandatory death penalty for drug offences. So far this year there have been 8 executions in Singapore, all for drug offences. So Kirsten, I'm hoping you're about to appear on the screen. Kirsten speaking today in her capacities on behalf of ADPAN. ADPAN advocates for 20 countries in the Asia-Pacific region, with 10 countries across Asia sentencing people to death for drug offending. ADPAN supports its members by strongly advocating against these punitive policies. So Kirsten, can I start by, welcome, good to see you. Can I start by asking about the role that women play in drug offending? We know that a high proportion of women on death row had minor roles. Can you tell us more about some of the shared common threads of the women on death row for drug offending?
Yeah, so we find generally that women are convicted of non-violent drug-related offences at a significantly higher rate than men. And of course, this doesn't mean that women are running the drug syndicates. It actually, the vast majority of women who are convicted, whether they are sentenced to death or not, or made to serve long terms in prison, are really on the lowest rungs of these drug syndicates. Many of them are couriers, recruited because they are perceived as being less likely to get caught or more easy to control or manipulate. Of course, most jurisdictions will never admit that their laws or their processes are discriminatory, racist, or sexist. But even when the system isn't explicitly designed to discriminate, we do know that the brunt of harsh drug laws, including the death penalty, is borne by those who are in the most vulnerable positions. So economic marginalization is a big factor that pushes people into the drug trade, especially on those lower rungs, because they don't have other viable alternatives to provide for themselves and their families and their dependents. Many of the women who get caught in the drug trade come from these backgrounds that have been marginalized. And, they're either coerced, manipulated, forced, or face violence and threat. And that's how they end up in the drug trade. And when they are arrested and put through the legal process, these are not really taken into consideration, especially in cases where there's mandatory sentencing. And their marginalization applies throughout the process, right? So it starts from how they entered the drug trade in the first place and goes all the way through their ability to have decent legal representation, their ability to afford lawyers, struggles with language barriers during police interrogation, during trial, and in prison. And all this has serious implications for procedural fairness. We see this in Asia, especially when there are cases of women who are migrant workers who are particularly vulnerable, because when they are arrested, they are far from home, they don't have networks, they don't have any social capital, financial capital to deal with what they're facing, and there are often language barriers and a lack of people who can advocate for them. And I think I'll keep this short here because we do have speakers later who will talk much more about Mary Jane Veloso's case, and she's a very clear example of how women who are accused of being drug traffickers are often themselves exploited, coerced, manipulated, often themselves trafficked to be part of the drug trade.
Thank you,
and I think when we look at the executions in the region, unfortunately, my country is one of the countries that are high application. We do see that this is a result of that sort of hardline position that insists on looking at drugs as a criminal issue. And I think just to pick up on what was mentioned earlier about the Commission on Narcotics Drugs expert panel, the Singapore representative who is co-chairing the panel is not a healthcare worker, not from the social service. She is from the Attorney General's chambers, which is the state prosecution. So it's very clear what the orientation is. And I think that's an orientation that we urgently need to push against. And I think my last point would be that when we talk about gender and the death penalty, we tend to focus on the gender of the person on death row, and rightfully so, but we also cannot forget that the death penalty doesn't just apply to the people who are on death row, because there are ripple effects beyond death row and beyond prison, running through families and communities. So in my country, in Singapore, we actually have very few women on death row, but in our experience working with death row prisoners' families is that even when it's the men who are on death row, it's the women outside prison who have to step up to do the caregiving work, to juggle the need to deal with lawyers and the legal system, to come up with financial support and to do public campaigning. So regardless of who is actually on death row, the death penalty is a highly gendered issue.
Kirsten, can I just briefly ask you just to zoom in on Malaysia, because in 2023 Malaysia abolished the mandatory death penalty and then went through a process of resentencing everyone who had been on death row on a mandatory regime to and the results have been quite startling in terms of women on death row. Could you just share some of that information here?
Yeah, so Malaysia went through this resentencing process after the abolition of the mandatory death penalty, and it led to a really drastic reduction of the death row population, which is really hopeful for us watching all the trends in the region. But there are still women on death row. I believe there's still at least one woman on death row in Malaysia at the moment. And as long as the death penalty remains, they've abolished the mandatory death penalty, but as long as there's discretionary death penalty still, it still opens up the likelihood of people being sentenced to death for drug offences. And if that's the case, then the concern that women would be disproportionately facing the sentence is still a very live issue, even in Malaysia, where we think things are hopefully going in the right direction.
Thank you, Kirsten. I'm now going to throw to my colleague Aisha Humaidia, who is a human rights lawyer at LBH Masyarakat. Aisha, we'll see you appear on screen magically in a moment, but Aisha and her team have been working very hard for advocating for marginalised people, including many people on death row in Indonesia for almost 2 decades. Hello. Including Mary Jane Veloso, whose case we're going to focus on with both Aisha and our next speaker, Attorney Edray. But firstly, Aisha, you and your colleague Risti Nabilia just released a report entitled Accumulated Suffering Under Relational Punishment, a Portrait of the Lives of 6 Women on Death Row and Their Families. It would be great if you could share with us, please, your findings in your report and your reflections on the case of Mary Jane. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. So, in early 2026, LBHM published a report on women on death row that adopts a distinct approach from previous studies on capital punishments. The report employs a feminist perspective, reclaiming women narratives that have long been overlooked by the justice system and stigmatized by the media. This approach seeks to create space for them to articulate the stories and life experiences that have shaped their trajectories. The study is based on interview with 6 women on death row, 2 convicted of homicide, and the others related drug cases. They have been incarcerated for periods ranging from 6 to up to 20 years. And the finding reveal recurring patterns across the cases, particularly in terms of the experience and circumstances that position them in situations leading to their involvement in criminal acts. And the first is experience of violence. In this report, 6 family death row inmates exhibiting a recurring pattern of experience of violence, particularly within domestic relationship. All of them were subjected to violence by their partners, and at the time the criminal acts occurred, they were in various forms of romantic relationships. Some had been married, some were still in marriage, and others were attempting to rebuild relationship after the breakdown of a previous marriage. Several had already experienced violence in prior marriages and subsequently faced further abuse in their later domestic relationship. In addition, they were confronted with a combination of economic hardship, physical and psychological violence, and dependency on their partners. These situations often force them to continuously compromise and in some cases to submit to their partner demands despite the associated risks. In certain cases, such as one for the homicide cases and one for drug cases, this dependency and violence escalated into coercion to participate in criminal acts, including murder and drug trafficking. And then the violence experience was not always directly infected by intimate partner, but also stemmed from family environment for the absence of protections within a relationship. The experience of one of Indonesia national who lived abroad for years demonstrate how insecurity, verbal abuse, and psychological pressure can create a cycle of violence that is difficult to break. In such conditions, women are often placed under extreme psychological pressure, ultimately leading them to make a fatal decision. This underscores that the absence of safety and protection play a significant role in shaping actions that later result in civil legal consequences, including capital punishment. And also for the influence of intimate partner, same as the global report, the pattern is also evident in the Indonesia context. However, such influence doesn't operate in isolation. Rather, it closely linked to unequal power relations. Within this dynamic, women frequently occupy a vulnerable position due to a combination of emotional and economic dependency, as well as experience of violence that constrain their ability to make autonomous decisions. These unequal power relations are often accompanied by repeated violations, both physical and psychological, which ultimately pressures women into actions beyond their control. And two cases of this finding demonstrate that involvement in criminal acts is not a manifestation of free will, but rather the result of coercion, threat, and fear. Also, attempt to resist often lead to further violence, reinforcing women's subordinated position within this relationship. Beyond direct violence, partner may also exert influence through seductive or manipulative approaches, particularly in drug-related cases. Some women become targets due to their vulnerabilities, including prior experience of violence and unmet need for affections and protections. Relationship initially perceived as expressions of love instead become entry point into criminal network. But in this finding illustrated how emotional manipulation, power asymmetries, and socioeconomic conditions are deeply intertwined in shaping women's involvement in criminal offenses. And the third is about inadequate financial conditions. It because for two conditions, education, employment, and financial access related power relation. So the law fails to recognize that inequality in education and access to employment shape vulnerability from the outset. Women with low level of educations are often limited to informal sector characterized by low wages, job insecurity, and lack of labor protections. However, in legal proceeding, these conditions are not treated as a relevant background factor, but rather as something presumed to have no bearing on their choices or involvement in criminal acts. And the law also failed to adequately understand that poverty and economic dependency within domestic relationship create from coercions that are not always visible as direct violence. Restrictions on employment, economic control by a partner, and equal access to information regarding husband's source of income place women in position where genuinely autonomous decision-making become difficult. In practice, however, the law doesn't treat these conditions as significant factors in assessing women's role, intent, or criminal responsibility, thereby erasing the structural vulnerability within the judicial process. And how the legal system respond, according to the finding from the 6 women, the examinations of defendant backgrounds, particularly for those women, has yet to become a standards requirement in legal proceedings, including in cases carrying the death penalty. As a result, women's experience of violence are rarely considered as contributing factors to their involvement in criminal acts. In many cases, however, the link between violence and women's position as defendant is significant, yet frequently overlooked by law enforcement authorities. And more broadly, the criminal justice system fails to adequately recognize and account for women's vulnerability in the legal process. Fundamental principles such as the presumption of innocence, right to fair trial, and quality of arm are not fully upheld. Rather than examining context of violence, power imbalance, or economic dependency, the system tends to focus on punishment, assessing women's action as stuff they were the product of fully autonomous choice. And also in practice, women's vulnerability are either disregarded or even distorted into ground for harsher sentencings. Experience ex-victim of violence, exploitations by intimate partner, or economic coercions are not acknowledged as mitigating factor. Instead of, women are often presumed to possess criminal intent and judged as having failed to resist or treated as equivalent to principal offenders. And moreover, serious procedural violations persist, including torture, restricted access to legal counsel, absence of interpreters, particularly for foreigner, and effective legal presentations. And media also driven stigma that reinforce bias against women. Some of the media state heroin queen for the woman with drug cases, and murder with the brutal murderer for the homicide cases. Consequently, are not only tried for the actions, but also judge moral constructions and gender stereotypes. This underscores that the criminal justice remain insufficiently responsive to vulnerability, lacks of gender perspective, and fail to ensure substantive justice, particularly in cases involving the death penalty. And in addition to that, the failing of the justice system, they also endure suffering that is systematically imposed but not counted as suffering or punishment. After all, punishment should merely restrict a person's freedom, not add another layers of suffering. But this finding also found another layer of suffering that unacknowledged by state or by the law. First, about limited opportunities for commutations for death row. So, death row prisoners in Indonesia are excluded from a range of fundamental correctional rights, such as remission, assimilation, parole, and family leave. No dedicated legal framework is designed specifically for them. Living clemency, some of the death row prisoners submit for the clemency, but living clemency as the only available non-judicial remedy. So clemency is the only way to get the commutations. However, clemency sometimes not guarantee for the outcome and frequently exceed prescribed the time.
Having some Zoom issues. Perhaps what we'll do is come back to Aisha, and
prisoner as sorry.
No, sorry. We just had a bit of interruption in transmission, but you're back. But Aisha, if you could just finish up your comments, that would be great.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Elegance and structural design of suffering, and the last also meaningful rehabilitations, because sometimes all the activities in the prison only for awaiting executions, and they have no rehabilitation framework that designed to address unique circumstances, need, and future outlook for death row prisoners. And the last also, they don't have psychological assessment, and within the system has no commutation. I'm not thinking about the new law, Penal Code Indonesia, but in this finding is there is no, if the system didn't provide of the commutations, they also deprive them from the right to hope. And these situations might differ somewhat for foreign national death row prisoner. As Sarah mentioned, the next speaker will elaborate further on the case of Mary Jane. So for the Mary Jane Veloso, and for another foreign national, sometimes face distinct challenges, including difficulties in representing witness, particularly in drug cases, where many enter Indonesia as drug carrier. In addition to the lack of mitigating witness, the act of drug trafficking itself often leads to presumption of criminal intent, making it difficult for them to mount an effective defense. regardless of their underlying motivations or the circumstances of their involvement. And one of the most critical vulnerabilities concerns is the right to...
We're going to have to move on to Edre, otherwise we're going to run out of time. But thank you so much. And I'm now going to hand over to Attorney Edre Olalia. Attorney Edre has been advocating for people on death row for over 30 years. In 1995, he acted for Floor Contemplation, a Filipino domestic worker who was executed in Singapore, which drew widespread condemnation. Attorney Edre and his team at the National Union of People's Lawyers have been advocating for Mary Jane Veloso since her arrest in 2010. Aisha just touched on the case of Mary Jane Veloso. I'm sorry that we're a bit rushed for time, but I do think it's important to note that today is the 11th anniversary of the executions that took place in Indonesia. On the 29th of April 2015, 8 people were executed. People in Australia heard a lot about Myron Sukumaran and Andrew Chan, but there were also 6 other people executed that night, 3 people from Nigeria, someone from Ghana, Indonesia and Brazil. But also on that night, in a miraculous type of event, Mary Jane Veloso, a Filipino domestic worker, was pulled off death row literally at the 11th hour. She was granted a reprieve in 2015 and then remained on death row in Indonesia until December 2024. Unfortunately, she's still in detention, and her lawyer, Attorney Edre, who's been with her since 2010 advocating on this case, is joining us now. Edre, I'm hoping you're about to appear on the screen. Thank you, Edre. Can you please tell us a bit more about why Mary Jane Veloso is still in custody and on what basis she was released back from Indonesia to the Philippines in December 2024?
Well, good morning first of all from Manila. Well, unfortunately, 11 years to the day when she was miraculously, as you said, saved from the gallows, she remains in prison in a correctional institute for women. Quite in anomalous circumstances, because she's still detained in her own country for a crime that she allegedly committed in another country, which country itself has already released her. So the case has been going through the twists and turns. It's been a long and winding road. In the meantime, we are pushing for her clemency, mainly on humanitarian grounds. We're not even talking about the legal basis yet, no, for her release. But at the same time, for the information of our friends, the illegal recruiters of Mary Jane, the very same illegal recruiters, are already in prison for a related case involving 3 other Filipino women. Those recruiters were convicted. But the case which involves Mary Jane herself as the complainant is still ongoing. As a matter of fact, in the local court in the Philippines, as a matter of fact, she is the only remaining witness of the prosecution that has yet to be presented. And the case was filed way back in 2015. That's 11 years ago. So that's where things stand now, Sarah.
Just for more context for the people watching and here, Edre, could you just let people know what was Mary Jane charged with in the first place and convicted of in 2010 when she flew to Malaysia to do work?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, Mary Jane is a very young Filipina single mother of 2 little children. She was convinced by her god sister, a relative by affinity, to work in Malaysia, promising her that there's a job waiting for her. only to find out when they reached Malaysia that that job was non-existent. And it turns out that it was a modus operandi because she was told that there's another job waiting in Jakarta, and she was given a suitcase by the friend of this illegal recruiter in Kuala Lumpur. Unbeknownst to her, upon arrival in the airport in Indonesia, the authorities found stitched or hidden in the lining of the luggage that was given to her were, I think, 2.6 or so kilograms of heroin. So she was prosecuted, and in very quick fashion, though, she was by the court in Indonesia, and 11 years to the day today.
Thank you, Edre. It's slightly lapsing now, but yep. Can you hear me, Edre? The last question I just want to really highlight in November 2025. You, along with the National Union of People's Lawyers, filed a petition of habeas corpus to the Supreme Court of the Philippines, calling for Mary Jane's immediate release on the basis that there's just no legal basis to her current detention. Where's that application at? What's happening with that?
Correct. Well, this is the legal track. No? The clemency track is the humanitarian aspect of her release. But not at quarrel with each other, but the legal track is that we're asking that she be released basically on two grounds. There is no judicial warrant, much less a judicial conviction, nor a law that justifies her continued detention in the Philippines. No, it is by virtue of a mere executive agreement of a transfer of prisoner between Indonesia and the Philippines, which until now is undisclosed, by the way. And the second basis of the habeas corpus petition, that is to ask her to be released legally or judicially, is that it is contrary to the Palermo principle, which many of you probably know, which is to protect victims of human penalized for acts directly related to human trafficking.
Thank you, Edre.
Did you get me?
We did. We did.
It
is lapsing a bit, but thank you very much because we really, I think Mary Jane Veloso's case really draws together so much of what we've been speaking about. We're talking about, a woman who's already served 14 years on death row in Indonesia for a crime that she didn't. She's a trafficked woman. She shouldn't have been convicted in the first place, let alone had to serve a 14-year term. Face the firing squad being saved by less than an hour from execution 11 years ago today, to return to Manila where she's remained. I think we're at 14 months and ongoing in detention. So I think ending with Edre and ending with Mary Jane's case is really important, and please do what you can to amplify her case, follow it. We really try and amplify Edre's work on ADPAN, on Capital Punishment Justice Project. Please look to amplify that. I'll hand back now to Lynette. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That draws to a close our speakers. We've got a couple of minutes for question and answer. I just wondered if anybody from the floor would like to ask a question of our panellists. We also have, Molly has people online, and I guess we've got some questions lined up there too. So anybody from the floor? Keep it brief, obviously. Yes.
Emotional topic for lots of people, and it's really a struggle for most people to move away from that. How do you think that we can kind of convince people to... How do you think that we can convince kind of people to get on board with moving away from punitive justice, because I think people are still really emotionally attached to it.
Who do we still have online at the moment? Kirsten, are you there?
Yep.
Would you like to answer the question?
Yeah, I think that is a very big question and something we grapple with a lot in Singapore, where, you know, the sort of war on drugs mentality has been the predominant narrative of the drug issue for many, many years, and is still basically the only narrative that's allowed in the local mainstream media. So it is very difficult to kind of get people to break away from that mode of thinking, from seeing drugs as only an issue of crime and punishment rather than health and care. And so in Singapore, I'm part of the Transformative Justice Collective, where a lot of the work that we do is also trying to educate people about drugs, what is drugs, what they are, what is drug use. You know, there's still a lot of belief that the narrative in Singapore is still very much that sort of like one puff and you're hooked for life and that's the end of your life sort of idea. So even very basic things of like, did you know that alcohol is also a drug, and we don't criminalize it in the same way that we do cannabis? Just these very basic things, I think, are very fundamental to getting people to think harder and differently about how they approach this issue, right? To just bring up and say, look, the fact that alcohol is readily available, even if expensive, and cannabis is something that gets a mandatory death penalty, it's not a fact because cannabis is so much more harmful and therefore we have no other choice. It was a human decision, it was a political decision. And is that a decision that makes sense to you? Is that a decision that we should question more? These sorts of things, I think, are really important in getting people to start thinking about it. Telling the stories of people on death row have also been really useful in resonating with people, because suddenly they realize that the people on death row are not like, they're not all like the Pablo Escobars of the world, because everyone is always imagining a drug trafficker as, you know, some violent person who's stocking huge amounts of drugs and making huge amounts of money. And then when we point out that all these people on death row are more likely than not to be mules and couriers, then suddenly people ask a lot more questions. So I think that's really important.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor?
If I can jump in there, am I still on?
Oh yes, Adib, Prof,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah, please just call me Adiba. I want to agree with what Kirsten's just said, but I think the importance of the media and importance of religious leaders and giving all these organizations that communities listen to the facts, as Kirsten has said, is very, very important. That's what we're trying to do here in Malaysia, engage in terms of the drug policy reform work, trying to engage with these organizations collectively, you know, so that they understand and that they understand that, you know, there's much new knowledge about drug use that probably didn't exist in the 1950s, 1970s, when drug laws were put together. You know, getting people to understand that, getting people to understand the risk factors, the complexity of you know, substance use and addiction is also very important. So community engagement, education are all essential. Yeah.
I don't know anything about it, so just hang on. You can say, I don't know anything about it, sorry.
Much depends on who you're trying to convince. We know from work with communities that peer education is really powerful, and we've seen big shifts in some countries where police who are friends of harm reduction talk to other police about drug use. Also where we have opportunities to put a human face on drug use, and I think in contexts like this, helping people understand how drug policy is a feminist issue can also help.
Thank you. Molly, do you have a quick question from our online audience?
Yeah, there's a question online here about funding. So who is funding this movement? And maybe also who should be funding this movement?
Ruth, you understand the funding framework internationally?
We don't have much. I mean, since basically, like this network, the Women in Harm Reduction International Networks, contracts were cancelled at the beginning of last year. As Ailish was also touching on, the impact of the Trump administration and a number of other countries that are shifting funding away from aid towards defence has measurably impacted our sector, especially gender-responsive harm reduction services have been closed down. Whole important advocacy networks have closed down, and obviously the basic services and sexual and reproductive health rights of women who are the most marginalised is the first to go. So we do need to get this issue firmly in the sights of the women's movement, where it hasn't been before, for the reasons that I was labouring over earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Ruth. I think that's a real take-home message. We need more allies in this struggle, and I think today you've had a very privileged opportunity to get a very broad description, from policy to activists to warriors to pleasure. The whole spectrum, I think, has been presented today. So please consider joining us. There's some fabulous resources over there on the table, QR codes to take home so you can read and join us. Now, we have one announcement to make about
I'll be super quick, but storytelling was brought up. My name's Laura from Women Beyond Walls, and we've been working with the World Coalition, and in just over a month's time we're launching 10 films that are on the gendered impacts of the death penalty, and unsurprisingly quite a few of those films also focus on drugs, and that intersection, including from some of the wonderful speakers we've heard today, but each film is 5 minutes long, and it's going to come with an educational resource pack that communities can use to talk more about this issue. So I will share that with everybody and all of the organisations here.
What was your organisation, Laura?
Women Beyond Walls.
Women Beyond Walls. Thank you, Laura. So that brings to a close our session. I'm sorry we really have to keep to the deadline. Thank you all for coming, and I'd like to thank our supporters and our backers. They're listed up at the top, along the top there, but I can't close without saying thank you to AVIL, to Women in Harm Reduction International Network, Elios Justice, the Asian Death Penalty Asia Network, Harm Reduction International, and the World Coalition. So thank you, and how about a round of applause for all our speakers? And we hope to see you in the struggle. Thank you very much. Please help yourself to the information on the table there.
The front could help us turn around the chairs. That would be fantastic. Thank you.